talking about the Greeks to classicists, which makes me feel like telling Moses what the Torah is all about. Of course, scares the hell out of me, and I can only hope that Thomas and Nadav will save my whatever in your responses. So, it may be a truism to say that the ancient Greek and Near Eastern worlds belong geographically, historically and culturally together. However, and I repeat now what has been said already a couple of times in this conference, the academic structures have since the 19th century separated classicists, Assyriologists and biblical scholars from each other, throwing them to different faculties and departments, competing with each other and often mistrusting each other. And this has for all too long prevented us from perceiving the ancient Eastern Mediterranean cultural area as a whole, both in terms of unity and divergence. For example, in the study of the phenomenon of prophecy, which, according to my definition, is human transmission of allegedly divine messages, inspired speech, if you prefer. In the study of the phenomenon of prophecy, scholars of classical antiquity have traditionally not communicated very much with their biblical and ancient Near Eastern colleagues, and this has led to the study of the Greek oracle and the biblical and the Near Eastern prophecy as if these were two or three strictly distinct categories. Fortunately, the times they are changing, and this can be seen in the increasing recognition of the Near East in studies on Greek divination, and also in a growing number of studies comparing biblical Near Eastern and Greek sources from the point of view of prophecy and divination. This bibliography is very short, but I can tell you it's almost exhaustive. And of course this conference is a strong sign of the change that is taking place, and I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to Irad and Alex for organizing such an epoch-making event as we are having now, and inviting me to speak in front of you. It's a privilege to be here. The title of my presentation, Prophets and Kings, combines two institutions that tend to appear together, whether we read Greek, biblical or Near Eastern sources. Studies in prophecy have demonstrated that all over the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, including Mesopotamia, rulers have consulted prophets, among other diviners, and to find advice and legitimation for their rule and actions. And prophets, on the other hand, have depended on the royal recognition of their divinatory skills. The communication between kings and prophets did not follow the same pattern everywhere, however, and in this presentation I will compare Greek and Mesopotamian sources to see where this communication takes divergent courses and why this may be the case in the texts available to us. I want to emphasize that I am comparing texts, not prophets or kings. It is quite probable that the texts do reflect historical circumstances, but there are no photographic snapshots of wie es eigentlich gewesen. They rather represent the point of view of their writers and probably conceal as much as they reveal. This must be borne in mind when constructing the historical image of prophecy. The institutions of prophecy and kingship appear as inseparable in the ancient Near Eastern sources, where prophets seem to prophesy first and foremost to kings, and seldom to any other people. The typical inquirers of the Greek oracle, on the other hand, were not kings, but rather the citizens of a city-state, Athenians, Spartans, Milesians, and so on, as private individuals or as a collective. Therefore, the position of the institution of kingship in the divine-human communication is somewhat different in the Greek world from what we read from the Near Eastern sources. But even in the Greek configuration, prophecy maintains its political and social-religious function as the source of divine knowledge necessary for the appropriate maintenance of the society, whether a monarchy or a democracy, sort of, as in the case of Athens. It is not at all exceptional to find kings as addressees of prophetic oracles, even in Greek sources, whether themselves inquiring the oracle or sending envoys to do it on their behalf. The Delphic oracle in particular is told to have been consulted not only by kings of Greek states, you have a list here, but also kings of more remote lands such as Lydia, Cyrene, Egypt, Macedonia and Rome. Reasons for turning to the Delphic oracle included warfare, political alliances, plague or sickness, legislation, and marriage. And the typically royal concern is of course royal succession, consulted at Delphi, for example by King Gyges of Lydia, who according to Herodotus was promised the kingship of Lydia, but was also warned that the vengeance of his rivals, the Heracleidae, would follow upon his descendants in the 5th generation. Philip of Macedonia, as related by the Alexander romance of Pseudo-Callisthenes, was told at Delphi that his successor, mounting the horse Bucephalus, will rule the world. So Philip's son Alexander the Great is identified here by the name of his famous horse. Alexander himself is presented as especially active in seeking advice from oracles, including Delphi, where he received encouraging oracles concerning his expedition against Persians, and was warned about plots against him in Macedonia, and also Didyma, whose oracle was revived after a long period of decay to play part in supporting Alexander's cause. The oracle of Didyma is also reported to have been consulted by, for example, Croesus of Lydia, who, according to Herodotus, tested several oracles to find out how reliable they were, by Seleucus Nicator, who was advised not to go to Macedonia but to stay in Asia, and Roman emperors, including Diocletian, who is said to have been prompted by Apollo to persecute Christians, and Julian, who sent to Delphi, Dodona and the other oracles to find out whether he should take the field to invade Persia, receiving a positive answer. The oracles of Claros are predominantly proclaimed to cities and individuals, the ones that have survived to us. Sources recording Roman emperors consulting the Clarion oracle have not been preserved. However, there is one inscription found on Hadrian's wall in Britain, reading Diis de abusque secundum interpretationem oraculi clari Apollonis, to the gods and goddesses in accordance with the interpretation of the oracle of Apollo at Claros. This same text has been found in no less than 9 other inscriptions, from Dalmatia, Pisidia, Sardinia, Galicia, and North Africa. The Clarion oracle referred to in these inscriptions was previously interpreted as having been received by Caracalla as a reply to his inquiries concerning his illness in 213 Common Era. Recently, however, Christopher Jones has argued that all 10 inscriptions are connected with the Antonine Plague in 160s, causing Apollo of Claros to issue an oracle concerning the plague, probably upon the consultation of Marcus Aurelius. The remarkable feature of this inscription, besides its wide distribution, is the dedication to gods and goddesses, Diis de abusque, that is, to any deity worshipped in the different parts of the Roman Empire, in accordance with the interpretation of the oracle of Apollo at Claros. And this implies an exegesis that made the royal oracle pronounced at Claros applicable to local circumstances. As such, this inscription provides important evidence of secondary use of prophecy in the Roman imperial setting. Greek prophecy and divination have recently been the object of extensive study by many scholars such as Michael Flowers, Sarah Ives Johnston, Esther Aidinov, John Bowden, Faith Rosenberger, only to mention a few of the more recent studies. And kingship is only one of the many aspects of the use, function and significance of oracles, indeed the significance of religion for the Greek writers and societies. Nevertheless, the issue of prophecy and kingship is relevant with regard to Greek sources, and a comparison with the Mesopotamian sources reveals some palpable differences between the Mesopotamian and the Greek sources with regard to prophets and kingship. I have figured out 4 differences. You may call these ideal types if you like. First, while the documentation of prophecy in the sources from Mesopotamia, that is from the city-state of Mari from the 18th century BCE and Assyria from the 7th century BCE, these sources present the ruling king as the primary addressee of the divine messages and virtually the main protagonist in the prophetic process of communication. The Greek sources lay more emphasis on the oracles themselves, visited and consulted by private individuals, delegations from Greek cities, and at times also by kings from different parts of the Mediterranean world. As agents of divination, the Greek oracle sites appear much more autonomous than any Mesopotamian temples. This is probably due to differences in the historical development and functioning of the oracle sites. The Mesopotamian and West Semitic centers of prophecy, such as the temple of Ishtar in the city of Arbela and the temple of Dagan in the city of Terka within the kingdom of Mari, these temples had a distinctively national function, and they seem not to have even attempted to provide services to foreign kings. The Greek world boasted a significant number of oracle sites throughout its history, most of which have a local character and therefore have left little traces in written documentation. However, a few oracles such as Delphi, Didyma, Dodona and Claros developed into internationally renowned sources of divine knowledge. And this is not only visible in the historical narrative, but also in archaeologically attested dedications from foreign countries to the respective temples. Secondly, the sources reflect differences in political structures. Assyria was an empire, while Greece, that is before Alexander and the Roman Empire, comprised a patchwork of city-states, and this positions prophecy differently on the political and ideological map of the Assyrian Empire compared to that of the classical and Hellenistic Greek world. The written documents of Assyrian prophecy present the prophetic kind of divination not only as an essential part of the universe maintenance of the Assyrian Empire, but also as a herald of the state ideology. In contrast, the famous Greek oracles had, at least in theory, an authority and legitimacy independent of the kings and city-states using their services. I'm not presenting this as another example of the autonomous West versus the authoritarian East, like freedom in the West, slavery in the Orient. I'm just saying that Greek prophecy never became a royal institution comparable to its Assyrian counterpart. And even the sources coming from the 18th century city-state of Mari, which was no empire but still quite influential at times, let prophecy appear as a primarily royal institution. Of course, this image is due to the set of the available sources, and this set of available sources mainly consists of royal correspondence in the case of Mari, so it is really hard to know how often the prophets at Mari prophesied to people other than the kings. All this is not to undermine the political significance of the Greek oracle. There was a strong social, religious and economical bond between oracles and their patron cities. So at Delphi as well as between the oracle of Didyma and the city of Miletus, and the oracle of Claros and the city of Colophon. When, for example, Miletus lost its independence when Xerxes conquered the city in 494 BCE, removing the cult statue and transporting the Branchidae priests to Persia, it also lost its oracle. Similarly, the functioning of the Delphic oracle was closely connected with the Greek political structure consisting of autonomous poleis, and it began to decline when the nature of political power changed in the wake of Alexander the Great. The third difference concerns the way the sources present the process of obtaining oracles. At Delphi and Didyma, prophecy seems to have operated in the same way as divination in general. That is, prophecies are presented as answers to questions posed by the consultants. Cases of spontaneous, non-solicited prophecy are rather the exception. Even oracular responses from Delphi, seemingly irrelevant to any question, are usually responses to a person who has inquired the oracle. In Mesopotamia, the case is quite the opposite. The vast majority of the texts at our disposal give the impression that prophecies brought to the king's notice were not triggered by a question, but were pronounced spontaneously, mostly in the absence of the addressee. That this is not the whole truth becomes evident from the few texts suggesting that prophetic oracles indeed were solicited by private persons such as the Assyrian scholar Urat-Ulat, as well as by court members such as the Assyrian queen mother Nakiya. The very meagre evidence of such consultations may be due to the simple fact that they left no written documents. It is important to notice, however, that the kings both at Mari and in Assyria regularly inquired oracles of the binary type, implying the answer yes or no, by means of extispicy and astrology, and these queries were written down. There is no record in which such a binary question is presented to a prophet. Neither are the words of the prophets formulated accordingly in any extant sought. The existing evidence warrants the conclusion that even in Mesopotamia prophecies were probably solicited, but unlike in Greece, the prophets were not expected to give answers to binary questions. This is one of the reasons why the division between technical and intuitive divination makes sense and works well with regard to the Mesopotamian sources, but in the case of Greece, an absolute division of this kind between technical and intuitive divination cannot be really upheld. The historical reasons for this conspicuous difference between Greek and Mesopotamian divination can only be speculated. Even if the Greek divinatory techniques formed part of the so-called Orientalizing revolution in the Greek world in the early Archaic Age, as Walter Burkert surmises, it is thinkable that the adaptation of elements of Eastern divinatory culture did not result in exactly similar structures. Fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, there is a difference concerning the origin and genre of the source material. Mesopotamian texts are for the most part primary sources deriving from royal archives, which explains a great deal of their royal focus. Whether we read oracle reports, inscriptions, or letters addressed to the king, we find prophecy representing the voice and the interests of the king and the court. In the Greek sources, the kings communicating with oracles are typically to be found in what Joseph Fontenrose calls quasi-historical responses, that is, reports of oracular consultations in secondary sources that are not contemporary to the event, but may still contain historical information depending on the reliability of the sources used by Herodotus, Thucydides, Plutarch, Diodorus, Siculus, and so on. It is indeed quite possible to find historical events recorded in these sources, but what is even more important is that the kings in these texts serve the needs of the writer's narrative strategies. The voice to be heard here is that of the narrator and his ideology, not that of the historical kings or their ideologists, mostly. And this, by the way, is also true for the Hebrew Bible, where the voice to be heard is never that of the kings of Israel and Judah or their ideologists, but rather that of the authors of the historical and prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible. In literary sources, the narrator's voice is distinct from that of the protagonist. This doesn't mean neutrality or disengagement from the point of view of the narrator, who has the power of defining the ideologies and intentions of his protagonists. A pro-protagonist example can be taken from Callisthenes' account of the massacre of the Prangidite priests and the revival of the oracle at Didyma by Alexander the Great. Callisthenes is the most contemporary source concerning Alexander's deeds, which he chronicled as they unfolded, and much of what he relates is probably based on events that actually took place. The primary objective of the narrative of Callisthenes, however, was not to write a disengaged description of events as they happened, but rather to construct Alexander's image as a divinely sanctioned ruler of the world. Hence, the tale of the revival of Didyma tells us more about the creation of Alexander's image than about the oracle itself. In this case, there is neither chronological nor ideological distance between the narrator and the protagonist, but the narrator's voice is firmly on the protagonist's side and in his service. Herodotus Herodotus takes clearly more distance of his protagonists, providing a prime example of a secondary use of prophecy in the literary setting created by himself. To quote Julia Kint, in his skillful collage of the omniscient voice of the oracles, the voice of the similarly omniscient narrator, and the limited perspective of the protagonist, Herodotus manages to build a complex picture of why empires can fall. Unquote. Herodotus' recurrent use of oracles reflects a conviction that they were trustworthy sources of divine knowledge and tended to be fulfilled unless they were misinterpreted, corrupt, or consulted in a faulty manner. This, of course, does not mean that Herodotus would only refer to historically authentic prophecies in our sense of the word. Prophecy forms an integral element in the symbolic world, necessary for keeping the Greek societies and their policies on the right track. Moreover, Herodotus used the oracle as the voice of greater authority that he himself could represent with moral or political judgments of his own. This, I believe, can be said whether we prefer to view Herodotus as a pious skeptic, aligning himself with the tradition of skepticism. This is the view of, for example, Scott Scullion and Walter Burkhardt, or a pious believer endorsing the premises of the religious matters he narrates, and this has been suggested by Thomas Harrison and John Michelson. References to oracles are anyway too many and too important in Herodotus to make him an utmost skeptic, but his use of oracles is much more subtle than a straightforward prediction-fulfillment pattern. Herodotus refers to oracles especially in his accounts on the Persian Wars, which he wrote distinctively from the point of view of Greek self-perception vis-à-vis foreign peoples, whether Persians or others. Indeed, the primary motivation for his history writing has been seen in the idea of a common Greek identity consolidated in the Persian Wars. This makes his history writing much more than just an exercise in describing the past. Rather, by writing about the past, Herodotus at the same time wrote to his contemporaries, fashioning his narrative in order to give his own particular perspective on the past and hence express his political views. This, I think, can be demonstrated by the account on King Croesus' testing of oracles that I already once referred to. Herodotus tells us that Croesus, at the height of his power but worried about the increasing power of Cyrus's Persia, sent envoys to the most famous oracle sites, including Delphi, Dodona, Didyma, and even the sanctuary of Ammon in Libya, asking the same question of what he was going to do in the 100th day after the departure of the envoys. Of all oracles brought to him in a written form, Croesus was only pleased with the response from Delphi, because the Delphic Apollo appeared to have had divine knowledge of his whereabouts. I know what you did last summer. Croesus didn't understand, however, what the readers of Herodotus are supposed to understand. By testing oracles to obtain a propitious answer, he himself found pleasing. He didn't acknowledge the difference between human and divine spheres and misunderstood the omniscience of Apollo by interpreting the oracle credulously in his own favor. Blindfolded by his own error, Croesus then misinterpreted the famous oracle that if he should march to Persia, he should destroy a great empire, as referring to Cyrus's defeat and not that of his own. That appeared to be the case. Herodotus presents Croesus as a king whose hubris makes him to forget his place, not appreciating the dividing line between the human and divine worlds. But the Croesus narrative can also be read as another example of Herodotus' making use of the past to encourage his Athenian audience to think to contemporary political realities and to look itself at the mirror, not repeating Croesus' misreadings, but understanding the whole account on Croesus as a lesson about the disastrous consequences of hubris. Let me now, by way of a conclusion, return to the construction of the historical image of prophecy. Every historical construction is dependent on sources that, in the case of prophecy, are lamentably haphazard and for the most part strongly biased. Mesopotamian prophecy is transmitted to us by and large from primary sources, which, however, represent a construct of prophecy faithful to the royal ideology. Greek oracle, again, is known to us mostly from secondary sources representing the point of view of their authors. Something like this can also be said of the Hebrew Bible. In both cases, I mean Mesopotamia and Greece, remnants, and maybe also the Bible, remnants of the authentic prophetic voice may be heard, but it comes to us through several filters and mixed with other voices. This must be kept in mind when mapping similarities and differences in the prophetic phenomenon as recorded in ancient Greece, Mesopotamia, or Israel. Different constructs of prophecy may go back to differences in the prophetic phenomenon, but they may also be created by the constructs themselves. And this is what makes the construction of the ideal types of prophecy, ancient prophecy, so difficult. As Bernie Levinson noted yesterday, the sources themselves construct ideal types that the scholars then develop further, often widening the gap between the sources. Similarities do not always point to influences. Neither do dissimilarities always imply the lack of influence. And mapping the influences is always hazardous if there are no sources proving the influences, and this, unfortunately, is more often than not the case. There is no reason to believe that Greek, Mesopotamian, and biblical prophecy represent three distinct and disconnected socio-religious phenomena, in spite of the fact that the image of the prophet and prophecy differs from source to source. Also, there is no need to look for an authentic source of prophecy, asking the hierarchical questions printed on the brochure at the conference, who was first, or first from where. And I hope I have been able to contribute to the multi-directional, non-hierarchical perspective on civilizational parallels and contacts called for in the brochure. I was very happy to read the brochure when writing my paper. Thank you very much.
Well, the coming 62 minutes will be split to three parts. We have now 20 minutes of two respondents. Then we'll have about 25 minutes of open questions, remarks from all of us. And at the end, we'll have enough time for the speakers to respond or to answer or to give a final note, if and when they like. So, the first respondent is Professor Nadav Na'aman from Tel Aviv University. Nadav.
I will talk about war communication in ancient Near East and the Bible. The main differences in war commemoration between the ancient Near East and classical Greece are the result of differences in regime and concept of the divine. The difference of regime was already discussed in detail, but the role of gods in commemoration requires elaboration. I will discuss three aspects, namely monuments commemorating wars in the ancient Near East, biblical commemoration of victories, and commemoration of the dead. Monuments are erected in public places where the common ancient Near Eastern way of commemorating victories. At the center of commemoration was the ruler, but side by side with him appeared God, who is always presented as the victor in battle. The concept of the leading power of God in victories is expressed in text and iconography. Ancient Near Eastern regimes were always monarchies, at the center of which was the ruler, and according to the commonly held royal ideology, the king was nominated and supported by God. Hence, God held a leading role in all victories. The presentation of God as the victorious power and the king as his agent is wholly different from that of Greece. Hence the many differences in the commemorating text in the two regions. B. In accord with the above-mentioned concept common to all ancient Near Eastern kingdoms, the God of Israel is always presented as the victor in battle. In some texts, God is presented as the unique Savior. The conquest stories in the book of Joshua well illustrate this. These wars are God's wars, and no heroic human deed appears in these stories. However, a dual causality, human heroism alongside divine help, appears in many other stories. These stories present two explanations of the victory. God's decisive role side by side with human valor. Human activity does not detract from God's status as the victor in battle, but nevertheless it is presented and emphasized, sometimes in great detail. Unlike the ancient Near Eastern monuments, where only the heroic deeds of the ruler is presented, a vast gallery of human saviors is related in the Bible. The story of the battle near Mount Tabor and the Song of Deborah present in a nutshell the above dilemma. In the prose story, the God is the exclusive victor and no human heroic deed is presented. In the song, on the other hand, God's theophany antedates his decisive role in battle. Quote, "From heaven fought the stars, from their courses they fought against Sisera," unquote. But human heroic deeds is also emphasized, as was presented in the lecture. In sum, the similarity of the Song of Deborah to Greek war commemoration is only partial, because the role of God in the song has no parallel in the West. C. There is another way of commemoration that deserves our attention, namely commemoration of the dead. In Akkadian text, the commemoration rite was called kispu, namely funerary offering to ancestors. It included the offering of food and drink for the spirits of the dead, a temu. According to ancient Near Eastern belief, the spirits of the dead stayed in the underworld, and to appease them and preserve them from harming the living, rites of commemoration for the dead were routinely conducted. Let me illustrate it by a remarkable text, the genealogy of Amitsaduka, the last king of the dynasty of Hammurabi, who reigned in the 16th century. The text was read aloud, and after a long list of 28 names of Amitsaduka's ancestors, the text continues as follows, quote, "The cycle of the Amorites, the cycles of the Canaans, the cycle of Gutium, any cycle which is not recorded on this tablet, and any soldier who fell while on the service of his lord, namely princes, princesses, or all other people from the east to the west, who have no one to care for them or to call their names. Come, eat this, drink this, and bless Amitsaduka, son of Amiditana, king of Babylon." Eat this and drink this refers, of course, to the offerings and drink that was served in the rite of kispu. It reminds us, of course, the rites of the anonymous soldier, but this was taking place twice every month. The text reflects not only the king's care for his ancestors, but also his care for the divine sphere of his kingdom. A central problem for the livings were those who have been buried, their souls who have not been buried, their souls did not properly descend into the underworld, and thus endanger the livings. One such group was soldiers killed in battle and not buried. The text under discussion illustrates how the problem was solved. The spirits of the deceased soldiers were invited to the royal rite of kispu, held for the ancestor of the reigning king. Amitsaduka's commemoration and care for the dead is remarkable, since he reigned reigned about 300 years after the rise of his dynasty in Babylon. And yet, we still feel the sense of Amorite tribal solidarity in the commemoration rite, which took place twice each month. The issue of the commemoration and rite for the dead in the West Semitic world is broad and is well attested in the Bible and archaeology. The text that I cited is unique, but the issue of commemoration and rite for the dead is common in many societies. Moreover, tribal solidarity is known in many kingdoms, including Israel and Judah. It would be logical to assume that commemoration for the soldier who died in the service of the Lord took place in other kingdoms as well, although textual indications are still missing. In sum, in light of the fundamental difference in regime and the concept of divine between the ancient Near East and Greece, there are remarkable differences in their ways of commemoration. The emphasis on the role of God in monuments in the East has no parallel in the West. In biblical text, the God of Israel is the Lord of history, and he held the leading power in wars and victories, unlike the place of God in Greek historiography, and the problems of the spirits of the dead is unknown in the West. I therefore conclude that in the aspect of commemoration, the difference between East and West are far greater than the similarity. Thank you.